They crossed the Atlantic not as conquerors, but as captives, their boots traded for shackles, their pride swallowed by the endless gray horizon. The sea groaned beneath the weight of troop ships, each one heavy not only with men, but with the silence of defeat. The salty wind bit at their faces, carrying with it the bitter taste of surrender. Through the small, round portholes, the prisoners caught their first glimpse of America not as the monstrous enemy painted in propaganda, but as something vast, unreal, and alive. The ports of Norfolk, New York, and Boston loomed like steel forests rising from the ocean. Cranes arched their necks toward the sky, trains clattered across distant bridges, and warehouses burst with goods that seemed almost mythic to men raised on scarcity. For many of the German soldiers, this was their first true confrontation with abundance, an America untouched by bombing, untouched by fear. As they watched dockworkers move briskly along the piers, laughing, shouting, and smoking as if the war were happening on another planet, something inside the prisoners began to shift. The enemy they had imagined cold, cruel, mechanical suddenly seemed human. Worse yet, enviably free. But fear clung to them all the same. They whispered among themselves, guessing what awaited beyond the docks. Some expected brutality, cold barracks, starvation. Others, having survived the Eastern Front, quietly prayed that whatever came next could not possibly be worse. Their uniforms were worn, their insignia stripped, their future uncertain. When the order came to disembark, boots thudded against the wooden planks in unison. Armed guards lined the gangways, but there was no shouting, no kicking, no cruelty, only quiet efficiency. It was disarming. The prisoners shuffled forward, heads low, the hum of America filling their ears, engines, sirens, music drifting faintly from somewhere unseen. On the docks, curious onlookers gathered. Children pointed. Women craned their necks. A few waved, half out of pity, half out of fascination. One young sailor, his cap tilted back, offered a cigarette to a prisoner through the fence. The German hesitated, then took it, lighting it with trembling hands. In that moment, something passed between them, something small, human, and unforgettable. The prisoners were loaded onto trains bound for the heartland. As the cars rattled westward, they stared through barred windows at a land too wide for words. Endless rows of corn swayed in the wind. Farmhouses stood clean and whole, their white paint unscarred by war. Church steeples rose from small towns like fingers pointing toward heaven. To men who had last seen cities reduced to rubble, this peaceful order seemed almost like a dream. In the stillness of the train car, some closed their eyes and tried to imagine what lay ahead. Others pressed their faces to the glass, unwilling to miss a single passing mile. "Look," one murmured, pointing to a child running beside the tracks, waving a small American flag. The others followed his gaze, their expressions unreadable. Pride, sorrow, envy all mixed together like smoke in the air. Hours passed, then days. The trains thundered across bridges, through valleys, over plains that seemed to stretch forever. Each mile carried them further from the war and deeper into an unknown land. At every stop, the guards handed out rations, bread, coffee, even fruit. It was simple fare, but to men accustomed to watery soup and stale crusts, it felt like a feast. Night fell. The prisoners dozed against the rattling walls, lulled by the rhythm of the tracks. Outside, the land rolled on vast calm and unbroken. Somewhere far behind them, Europe burned. Ahead lay something they could not yet name, captivity. Yes, but perhaps also a strange kind of freedom. When dawn came, the first sunlight spilled through the cracks in the shutters, painting stripes of gold across weary faces. One man stirred, rubbing sleep from his eyes, and whispered, almost to himself, "This does not feel like the enemy." No one answered him. But the silence that followed was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of men beginning to see the world differently. The journey that began in defeat was already becoming something more, the beginning of an unexpected lesson, written not in gunfire or blood, but in the quiet realization that even in war, humanity could survive. When the trains finally screeched to a halt, the men expected the worst. The words prisoner of war camp carried the weight of dread. They imagined concrete cells, barking dogs, and the cold echo of boots on iron floors. Instead, as the doors opened, sunlight poured in, and what they saw left them speechless. The camps were not fortresses, but villages of wood and wire. Rows of barracks stood neatly along gravel paths, surrounded by wide open farmland and skies that stretched forever. The fences were real barbed, glinting in the sun, but inside them, life seemed strangely ordered. Soldiers unloaded, blinking against the brightness, as American guards watched in silence. No shouts, no insults. Just routine. Each prisoner was assigned a bunk, a blanket, and a uniform without insignia. They were given soap, towels, and even a toothbrush, small, ordinary things that suddenly felt like luxuries. Then came the meal. Plates filled with bread, meat, potatoes, milk, food richer than most had seen since before the war. The first bites were cautious, unbelieving. The second, ravenous. One man later wrote in his diary, "I had expected punishment. Instead, I found dignity." The camp's order was astonishing. There were kitchens, hospitals, workshops, even chapels. American officers spoke through interpreters, explaining the rules clear, firm, but not cruel. The Red Cross would visit regularly. Letters could be written. Packages could be received. The men listened, suspicious at first, waiting for the hidden cruelty. None came. Days passed, and disbelief turned into uneasy acceptance. The barracks buzzed with quiet conversation, disbelief mingled with awe. "Why do they feed us so well?" one asked. "To break our spirits," another guessed. But no one could deny that they were being treated not as beasts, but as men. Outside the fences, life continued. Farmers tilled their fields. Children rode bicycles past the camp roads, glancing curiously through the wire. Some even waved. A few guards, young, barely older than the prisoners, began to exchange words or cigarettes during long watches. The prisoners could not reconcile it. These were supposed to be the enemy. Yet here, humanity kept intruding through the cracks of war. At night, when the camp settled into stillness, the sounds of America drifted over the fences, the hum of distant cars, a radio playing swing music, the faint tolling of church bells. The Germans lay awake, listening. To men used to the roar of bombers and the wail of sirens, this peace felt unreal. There was shame, too. Shame in their comfort while their families suffered under bombardment. Shame in their defeat. Some refused to eat, believing it dishonorable. Others stared at the horizon, longing for home, but unable to look away from the calm that surrounded them. For all its fences, the camp became a kind of sanctuary, a world suspended between past and future, where time moved differently. It was captivity, yes, but also a reprieve from the madness they had left behind. As weeks passed, the tension between expectation and reality deepened. The guards treated them fairly. The food never ran out. The inspections were regular but routine. In that routine, the men began to find something they had not felt in years: safety. Letters arrived thin, trembling words from mothers, wives, and children still enduring the war. The men wrote back carefully, describing their conditions but omitting the abundance. How could they write about milk and meat while their families scavenged for scraps? Some sent small carvings, made in the workshops, as tokens of survival. Bit by bit, the bitterness of defeat began to dissolve. In its place grew something quieter, a reluctant gratitude, a dawning respect for an enemy that, somehow, refused to act like one. And yet, a shadow remained. They were soldiers without purpose, men without a country. Beyond the fences, America's fields glowed with life, while theirs lay in ashes. Every evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, painting the sky in colors of peace, they were reminded of what they had lost. But within that loss, a seed was planted, fragile, almost invisible, the beginning of an understanding that would one day grow into something extraordinary. Morning began not with sirens or explosions, but with the clear, brassy note of a bugle echoing across the camp. It was a sound of order, not terror. The men rose from their bunks in disciplined unison, though the discipline now served no nation, no flag. Roll call followed. Names were counted, not shouted. The guards, standing tall in clean uniforms, spoke little. The prisoners saluted out of habit, not loyalty, and the ritual of obedience became, strangely, a comfort. Then came breakfast. The mess hall smelled of porridge, coffee, and fresh bread scents that carried both comfort and guilt. Some still hesitated before eating, murmuring that it was not right to enjoy what their families could not. Others devoured every bite, hunger stronger than shame. One man joked softly, "If this is defeat, it tastes better than victory." Laughter rippled through the line, short, uncertain, but real. The Americans believed in routine as medicine. Every day had its rhythm: roll call, work, meals, recreation, curfew. The structure left little room for despair. After breakfast, men were divided into work details: carpentry, tailoring, maintenance, or cooking. Others took classes, learning English or mathematics from instructors provided by the Red Cross. For the first time since the war began, their minds were engaged in something other than survival. Some rediscovered old skills. A violinist from Dresden started a small orchestra. A teacher from Cologne gave language lessons. A farmer from Bavaria organized a vegetable patch behind the barracks. Slowly, the camp became more than a cage. It became a strange, self-contained world. Evenings were the most unexpected of all. After supper, as the sun dipped low, the men gathered in open yards, smoking and watching the sky fade from gold to violet. The guards, standing at a distance, sometimes joined in quiet conversation. They talked not of ideology or battle, but of weather, baseball, or the women waiting for them at home. It was a strange fraternity, enemies divided by wire, but connected by boredom and humanity. One night, a young guard tossed a baseball toward the fence. A prisoner caught it, tossed it back. The next evening, another guard brought a second ball. Soon, games began, laughter spilling across the barrier. The barbed wire remained, but for those hours, it seemed invisible. In the camp workshops, creativity flourished. Men carved wooden toys, built model ships, or painted landscapes from memory, though sometimes the landscapes were not of Germany, but of the fields they saw through the wire. Some of those paintings would survive decades later, small windows into the quiet life of captivity. Music drifted through the evenings, too. Someone always seemed to have a harmonica, and from the barracks came melodies that mixed sorrow and serenity. Occasionally, guards would pause outside to listen. One American later recalled, "They played songs that did not sound like war. They sounded like home." But not every man found peace. Some struggled with the emptiness of purpose. Once soldiers of a mighty army, they were now spectators in a world that no longer needed them. The war continued elsewhere, and the guilt of safety gnawed at their pride. Arguments broke out not with guards, but among themselves. About the future, about honor, about who they were now that their weapons had been taken away. A few clung desperately to ideology, whispering about Hitler's promises, unable to accept defeat. But each passing week chipped away at the old certainties. How could they reconcile the vision of America as a ruthless empire with the reality of American soldiers who shared cigarettes and stories through the fence? The most profound change was invisible, happening not in the barracks or the workshops, but inside their minds. They began to see that captivity could be a kind of mirror, forcing them to look not at their enemies, but at themselves. The Geneva Convention rules were followed with meticulous precision. They were given books, lectures, even church services. For the first time, many faced ideas forbidden back home: freedom, equality, the notion that dignity did not belong to one race or one nation. As weeks turned into months, the camp settled into a steady rhythm. The men learned the sounds of American trains, the smell of approaching rain, the shift of light through their barracks windows. Life became predictable, almost gentle. It was not freedom, but it was something close, the freedom to breathe without fear. One evening, as stars shimmered above the camp, a prisoner named Carl wrote in his journal, "The strangest thing about being here is how alive I feel. The war took everything from me. But here, behind these wires, I have begun to remember that I am still human." The bugle would sound again in the morning, the roll calls would continue, and the days would follow their steady rhythm. Yet something irreversible had begun. These men, once taught to hate, were learning, slowly, what it meant to be treated not as soldiers, but as souls. By the summer of 1944, the rhythm of camp life had dulled into something almost too quiet. The days were orderly, the nights peaceful, and yet the men grew restless. Soldiers, without war, were like rivers dammed still on the surface, but turbulent beneath. Then, one morning, the silence broke. A new notice appeared on the bulletin board, printed in both English and German. It announced a work program volunteers requested for agricultural labor under supervision. The words carried both promise and uncertainty. To leave the camp was to step once again into a world beyond the wire, but also into the unknown. That week, the first trucks rolled out, carrying groups of prisoners under military escort. They sat in the open backs, clutching lunch pails, staring at the endless stretch of farmland unfurling before them. For many, it was their first real look at America, beyond fences, a land vast, fertile, and untouched by the scars of war. The field seemed to breathe. Rows of corn shimmered under the sun, windmills turned lazily in the breeze, and the air smelled of grass and grain, not smoke or ash. The prisoners were assigned to local farms, where the labor shortage had become desperate. American sons were fighting overseas. Someone had to bring in the harvest. When the first groups arrived, the atmosphere was tense. Farmers eyed the Germans warily. These were, after all, men who had fought against their sons and brothers. The prisoners, in turn, feared hostility or worse. But the work began quietly. Tools were handed over, orders given through interpreters, and soon the sound of shovels and tractors filled the fields. What followed was a transformation that neither side expected. The Germans proved capable, disciplined, hardworking, and skilled. Many came from farming villages in Bavaria, Saxony, or Prussia, and the work was second nature. They moved with practiced efficiency, repairing fences, harvesting crops, tending livestock. By midday, the tension had already begun to crack. A farmer in Kansas later recalled, "They did not talk much, but they worked hard. After the first week, they were just men in the fields, same as anyone else." The first gestures of trust came in small forms. A farmer's wife brought out pitchers of cold water and bread for the men. At first, they hesitated, waiting for orders, unsure if it was permitted. The guards nodded. The prisoners drank deeply, grateful but cautious. Later, the same woman brought out pie. That, too, they accepted awkwardly at first, then with shy smiles. These small acts repeated themselves across America in Texas, Iowa, Minnesota, Nebraska. Each meal, each shared laugh, chipped away at the wall that divided enemy from neighbor. Over time, the labor became routine. Trucks arrived at dawn, carrying groups of Germans who would spend the day harvesting wheat, stacking hay, or milking cows. The guards, often relaxed, watched from shaded porches, rifles slung low. Escapes were rare. Where would they go? The nearest town was miles away, and beyond that stretched a continent they could not navigate. For most, the fields were safer than any attempt at freedom. The farmers, once wary, began to see something unexpected. These prisoners were not the monsters they would seen in propaganda films. They were young, polite, often homesick. They shared stories of families, of little villages left behind, of wives and children waiting across the ocean. One farmer's son traded words in broken German, laughing as he tried to mimic the accent. Another brought his harmonica, playing tunes the prisoners did not know but soon learned to hum along with. By the end of the season, suspicion had softened into something like friendship. Farmers trusted the prisoners to work without constant supervision. Some even shared cigarettes or lunch under the shade of an oak tree. The Americans had expected resentment. The Germans, cruelty. Instead, they found mutual respect born from the shared language of labor. There were rules, of course strict ones. The guards kept count, and the boundaries of the fields were clear. But by autumn, the fear had faded. One afternoon, as the day's work ended, a farmer handed a German prisoner a small bag of apples. "Take them," he said simply. "You have earned it." The man hesitated, then nodded, his eyes bright with something that might have been gratitude or disbelief. Back at the camps, the returning prisoners carried more than baskets of produce. They carried stories. Stories of kindness, of laughter, of being treated not as captives, but as men. Around the barracks that night, the talk was animated. "They let us sit at the table," one said. "They gave us real coffee," said another. One woman asked about my mother. The camp, once gray and silent, buzzed with new energy. What began as mere necessity, the need for labor, had become something deeper. In the quiet fields of America, among rows of wheat and corn, the first threads of understanding were being woven between enemies. Neither side realized it yet, but those long, sunlit days of shared work were laying the groundwork for something even more remarkable, moments of connection that would one day be remembered not as part of war, but as part of peace. It began as most revolutions do, with something small, a gesture so simple it seemed insignificant at the time. One hot afternoon in Iowa, after hours of harvesting under a relentless sun, a farmer's wife brought a tray of lemonade to the edge of the field. The guards stood nearby, indifferent, as the prisoners hesitated, unsure whether they were allowed to accept it. Then she smiled and set the tray down on the grass. "Drink," she said. "It is too hot to work on an empty throat." That moment, repeated in countless towns across America, marked the first quiet fracture in the walls separating captor and captive. What started as an exchange of water soon became shared meals beneath shade trees. A slice of bread here, a cup of milk there. Small mercies that grew, almost without intention, into acts of trust. Farmers began to see the Germans not as nameless enemies, but as young men who could have been their own sons. The Germans, in turn, began to see their hosts not as propaganda's caricatures of decadence and greed, but as people decent, hardworking, and curious. Each encounter carried its own rhythm of hesitation and discovery. On one Kansas farm, a young prisoner named Heinrich spent weeks mending fences. The farmer's daughter, perhaps 12, would watch him from a distance, clutching a small notebook. One day, she approached shyly and handed him a drawing, a picture of the farm, sketched in pencil. Heinrich smiled, drew a tiny flower in the corner, and handed it back. That evening, her father invited Heinrich and 2 others to share sandwiches on the porch. It was the first time any of them had been inside an American home. For the prisoners, stepping through those doors was an experience that stirred something deep. The smell of cooking onions frying, bread baking hit them like a memory of another life. The polished wooden tables, the family photographs, the laughter of children, these were luxuries of peace they had forgotten existed. To be seated at a table, to be spoken to as a guest rather than a captive, carried a dignity no uniform could provide. Many later wrote about that feeling. One man described it simply: "They did not see the German soldier. They saw me." In towns where German ancestry ran deep, communication came easier. Farmers whose grandparents had spoken Bavarian dialects found common ground in familiar words. Essen, one would say, motioning to food. Danke came to reply. Soon, conversations half in German, half in English began to flow. Laughter bridged the rest. Of course, not everyone approved. In nearby towns, whispers spread they're feeding Nazis, some said. Local newspapers carried warnings about getting too close to prisoners. Yet those who had shared a table rarely cared. They had seen something different in the men who worked their land: exhaustion, humility, and a longing that mirrored their own. In Texas, one farmer recalled the moment he realized the line between enemy and friend had blurred. "They were eating my wife's cornbread," he said, chuckling years later, and she told them they could have seconds. "I figured if she was not afraid, neither was I." The Germans repaid kindness in small, sincere ways. They mended broken tools with skill, carved toys for the farmers' children, or repaired farm machinery that locals thought beyond saving. Some even left handmade gifts behind a wooden bird, a whittled cross, a sketch of the family's house. And then came the invitations, quiet, hesitant, but profound. After weeks of shared work and growing trust, families began to ask the prisoners to join them properly for lunch or coffee after church. A seat at the family table was no longer an act of charity. It had become an act of understanding. Inside those homes, time seemed to soften. Guards, seeing no threat, often waited outside while their charges sat at tables heavy with food, roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, steaming bread fresh from the oven. The men ate slowly, reverently, as if afraid to wake from a dream. Some confessed to guilt that they were eating like kings while their families starved back in Germany. But the kindness of their hosts eased that shame, turning each meal into something sacred. It was not about the food. It was about recognition, the rediscovery of humanity that war had buried. A few guards began to understand it too. They noticed the change in their prisoners, the relaxed shoulders, the quiet laughter, the absence of bitterness. One American sergeant later said they came back from those farms different, softer, like they would remembered how to be human again. And so what began as necessity labor to keep America's fields alive evolved into something far more profound. By the time autumn came, the rhythm of harvest had bound two worlds together in ways no one had planned. At dusk, the trucks would rumble back toward the camps, prisoners singing softly in the fading light. The guards listened but did not interrupt. The voices were not triumphant, nor mournful. They were the voices of men caught between two worlds, no longer enemies, not yet free. The fences still waited for them at night, glinting under the moon. But now, when they looked at those fences, they no longer saw just captivity. They saw the world beyond them, porches where they would have been offered coffee, fields where they would have been trusted, and homes that, for a few brief moments, had felt like peace. The war had taken everything from them. But in America's heartland, amid dust and cornfields, they had begun to reclaim something the war could never destroy, their humanity. By the time autumn swept across the American heartland, the workdays had settled into a steady rhythm of labor and quiet camaraderie. Yet something new was stirring in the small towns and farmsteads, a ritual that went beyond shared chores and fleeting kindness. It was something deeper, more intimate. It was the Sunday dinner. Sunday, in rural America, was sacred. The tractors fell silent, the fields rested, and families dressed in their best to attend church. Afterward, kitchens came alive, the air rich with the scent of roasted meat, fresh bread, and pies cooling on windowsills. For the prisoners who worked the farms, the day was different too. The guards were relaxed, the mood gentler. Some prisoners were allowed to attend church under supervision. Others waited outside, hearing the echo of hymns carried on the wind. And then, almost without ceremony, the invitations began. "Would you like to join us for lunch?" a farmer's wife asked one Sunday. Her voice was calm, kind, as though it were the most natural thing in the world to invite a German soldier into her home. The first time, the men hesitated, unsure if it was a test. But when they stepped inside, everything changed. The room smelled of coffee and fresh bread. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains, casting golden patterns on the table where a white cloth had been spread with care. Plates of mashed potatoes, roast chicken, green beans, and gravy waited. The Germans stood awkwardly until they were told to sit. For a moment, they simply looked around at the family photographs on the walls, at children giggling softly, at the steam rising from the food. And then came the most startling moment of all, prayer. The farmer bowed his head, his wife and children following. He spoke simply words of thanks, Words of peace, words asking for the safe return of loved ones, both theirs and others far away. The Germans bowed their heads too, some murmuring their own silent prayers in their native tongue. In that shared silence, the boundaries between enemy and host dissolved. The meal that followed felt almost dreamlike. The prisoners ate slowly, savoring every bite as though afraid it might vanish. Fresh butter, cold milk, the sweetness of apple pie, these were tastes they had forgotten existed. For men who had lived on watery soup and rationed bread, the abundance was overwhelming. Some even felt a pang of guilt, thinking of their families still enduring hunger and ruin back home. Children often broke the tension. Curious and unafraid, they peppered the Germans with questions, laughing at their accents, showing them toys or books. One soldier named Otto carved a tiny wooden horse from a scrap of firewood and gave it to a little girl who had asked about his family. She kept it for decades. Soon, Sunday dinners became more common. In Iowa, Minnesota, Texas, Alabama, across the country, these quiet gatherings repeated themselves, each one a small act of defiance against the hatred the war demanded. Soldiers once trained to kill now sat beside families who had every reason to despise them. They passed dishes, clinked glasses, exchanged smiles. For the Americans, it was a demonstration of faith, the belief that kindness was not weakness, that hospitality could exist even in wartime. For the Germans, it was a revelation. They had been told the Allies were merciless, godless destroyers. Yet here they were, being offered grace, both literal and spiritual, by the very people they had been told to hate. One prisoner later wrote, "I realized that day, sitting at their table, that everything I had been taught about Americans was a lie. They prayed. They laughed. They shared what little they had with us, the defeated. I began to see that humanity survives even in war." Not everyone approved of this closeness. Some townspeople gossiped, newspapers warned of dangerous sympathies, and a few officers frowned upon the fraternization. But most turned a blind eye, recognizing that these simple acts of kindness were keeping the peace not just in the camps, but in the hearts of men who might otherwise have grown bitter. The Sundays became an unspoken tradition. After church, families would bring out extra plates, guards would loosen their stances, and the smell of food would drift beyond the fences. For a few precious hours, the war seemed to vanish. There was something sacred about those meals, not because of the food, but because of what they represented. Forgiveness, understanding, the quiet courage to treat an enemy as a human being. When evening came, and the prisoners returned to camp, they carried with them more than full stomachs. They carried warmth, a memory of kindness that no order, no propaganda, no ideology could erase. The guards noticed it too. The men walked differently, afterward shoulders straighter, faces softer. And though they were still prisoners, those Sunday dinners had given them something beyond freedom. They had given them hope. As the war raged on across the ocean, these small American homes became sanctuaries of peace. In the flicker of candlelight, over steaming plates and whispered prayers, the first fragile bonds of reconciliation were being forged, one dinner, one gesture, one shared humanity at a time. By the time the leaves turned gold and fell across the fields, something remarkable had taken root between the German prisoners and the American families who had once looked at them with suspicion. What began as cautious civility had blossomed into genuine connection, a quiet understanding that needed no translation. Words were still clumsy between them. English stumbled over German, German tangled through English, and yet, somehow, they understood one another. A gesture, a smile, a shared laugh could bridge what language could not. Humanity, it seemed, had its own universal tongue. After those Sunday meals, families often lingered on their porches, reluctant to let the moment end. The prisoners would sit awkwardly at first, caps in hand, until conversation began to flow like a river finding its course. "Home," an American would say, pointing toward the horizon. "House," the German would answer, tapping his chest. Laughter followed, soft, genuine, the kind of laughter that heals. Music soon filled the silence where words failed. Some prisoners carried small instruments, harmonicas, accordions, violins that had survived the war's chaos. After dinner, they played songs from their villages, gentle folk melodies that drifted through the open windows and settled like blessings in the night air. Children clapped, farmers tapped their boots, and even the guards, leaning against their trucks, found themselves humming along. Sometimes the families returned the favor, turning on a radio to let the smooth swing of Glenn Miller or the croon of Bing Crosby fill the room. The Germans listened, amazed. Back home, this kind of music was banned, labeled degenerate. Yet here it was joyful, alive, free. One soldier, his face half hidden in the dim light, whispered, "If this is America's soul, then perhaps we never understood it at all." Food became another bridge. Though American kitchens were unfamiliar, the prisoners sometimes offered suggestions: a dash of salt here, a thicker bread there, an idea for sauerkraut made from the farm's leftover cabbage. In one Nebraska town, a family learned how to bake German rye bread from a POW named Lucas. Years later, long after the war, that same family still used his recipe every Sunday. The exchange went both ways. The prisoners tasted chili for the first time in Texas, corn pudding in Iowa, pecan pie in Georgia. They laughed, coughed at the spice, and learned to savor it. What was once strange soon became cherished. Beyond the laughter and the food, something even deeper stirred a shared sense of faith. Many of the Germans were Catholic or Protestant, and the rhythms of American worship felt familiar: the ringing of church bells, the hymns sung at sunset, the bowing of heads in prayer. When invited to attend services, some stood in the back, their uniforms a reminder of the war that still raged. But the sermons they heard spoke not of victory or vengeance, but of forgiveness, compassion, and the duty to see one's enemy as a fellow child of God. The words stayed with them. For men whose lives had been defined by command and conquest, to hear mercy preached from the pulpit of their enemy was profoundly disarming. In the evenings, conversations sometimes turned to home. The Americans spoke of rationing, of sons fighting overseas, of waiting for letters that took months to arrive. The Germans spoke cautiously of cities reduced to rubble, of wives and mothers scraping for food, of winters that seemed endless. And though their words were halting, the understanding was immediate. Pain needed no translation. Children, as always, were the easiest bridge of all. They asked the prisoners to tell stories, fairy tales, and fables that the men remembered from their own childhoods. The Germans told tales of Hansel and Gretel, Rumpelstiltskin, and the Bremen town musicians, unaware that these stories already lived in American nurseries too. The children listened wide-eyed, discovering that the strangers with strange accents shared the very same dreams. At night, when the prisoners returned to camp, they carried these moments with them. The harmonica tunes lingered in the air. The warmth of the family's laughter followed them into sleep. The guards often noticed the men talked softer, argued less, and seemed somehow lighter. One officer remarked, "You can teach a man to obey, but only kindness teaches him to change." In the years that followed, many former prisoners would look back on this time as the beginning of their transformation, the slow unraveling of everything they had been taught to believe about the world. They came to see that the greatest defeat was not military, but moral, to have been blind to the humanity of others. By the winter of 1945, across countless American towns, the fences between us and them had become little more than symbols. Inside kitchens and on porches, through music and stories and shared meals, the prisoners and their hosts had created something unthinkable: friendship in the midst of war. And though the world beyond still burned, in these small, quiet corners of America, a different kind of battle was being won for empathy, for understanding, for the belief that even in the darkest times, the light of human decency can still burn bright. By the spring of 1945, the war was ending. The guns in Europe were falling silent, and the world was preparing for the uneasy peace that would follow. In the American camps and farm towns, whispers of surrender reached the prisoners, first as rumor, then as reality. The men who had crossed the Atlantic in defeat now stood on the threshold of freedom, though few felt ready to claim it. Repatriation began slowly. Ships were loaded once more, not with soldiers for battle, but with weary men going home to a homeland they no longer recognized. They left behind the barracks and fences, the fields and porches, and the families who had once fed them as strangers and now waved them goodbye as friends. When the time came to depart, the goodbyes were often wordless. A handshake, a tear, a photograph pressed into a callous palm. In one small town in Kansas, a farmer's wife packed a loaf of bread and a folded note into a prisoner's satchel. It read simply, "May peace find you wherever you go." The journey back across the Atlantic was a mirror of the one that had brought them, but now everything felt different. The same ocean that had once carried them into captivity now carried them toward a homeland in ruins. They stood on deck, silent, watching the horizon, each man lost in his own thoughts. For the first time in years, they were free, and yet the taste of that freedom was bittersweet. When the ships reached Germany, the shock was overwhelming. Cities lay in rubble. Train stations were hollowed shells. Families, thin and exhausted, greeted their returning sons not with celebration, but with quiet disbelief. These men had survived captivity in America and returned looking stronger, healthier, even hopeful. Their stories seemed impossible. At first, many hesitated to speak of what they had seen. To say they had eaten well, been treated kindly, even prayed with Americans, felt like betrayal. But over time, the stories began to surface in whispered conversations, in letters, in journals smuggled back from the camps. They spoke of orchards heavy with fruit, of laughter shared over Sunday dinners, of guards who treated them with decency instead of hate. They spoke of families who opened their doors to enemies, and of children who waved them goodbye without fear. The stories spread like wildfire, each one a quiet rebellion against the propaganda that had once shaped their minds. For a generation raised to see the world as divided between the master race and the enemy, these stories carried a revolutionary message that kindness could exist anywhere, even in the heart of an opponent. In the shattered cities of post-war Germany, that message mattered more than anyone realized. It became a seed small, fragile, but alive, planted in the hearts of men who would go on to rebuild a nation. Some prisoners kept in touch with the families who had welcomed them. Letters crossed the ocean, written in halting English or careful German. "We are planting this year," one American farmer wrote. "The fields are not the same without your songs." Replies came months later. "My family is safe. The bread here is thin, but I remember yours." A few former prisoners even returned decades later. In the 1950s and 60s, old men with families of their own made pilgrimages back to the same towns where they had once labored in captivity. They arrived not in uniform, but in plain clothes, bearing gifts from their rebuilt homeland, photographs, trinkets, or simply memories. When they knocked on farmhouse doors, the faces that greeted them were older, but the warmth was unchanged. There were tears, laughter, and long embraces. Enemies had become friends, and the circle had closed. Historians would later call these encounters micro-miracles of reconciliation. But for those who had lived them, they were something more personal proof that humanity could survive the worst of wars. In Germany, these memories became part of family lore. Fathers told their children, "The Americans fed us when we were their prisoners." Mothers listened, astonished. Sons grew up hearing about the kindness of strangers across the ocean, stories that stood in stark contrast to the hatred that had fueled the war. Over time, those stories became the quiet foundation of reconciliation between two nations once sworn to destroy each other. And in America, in towns like Hutchinson, Topeka, or Waco, the memories endured too. Old farmers remembered the German boys who sang in their fields, the wooden toys left behind, the laughter that filled their kitchens on Sunday afternoons. Some families kept those carvings on shelves, small tokens of a friendship born in captivity. Others preserved letters pressed between Bible pages, yellowed with time. The war had ended, but its legacy stretched far beyond treaties and politics. In the lives of these men, in the hearts of those who met them, the real victory was not military. It was moral. It was the quiet triumph of decency over hate, of compassion over vengeance. Decades later, one former prisoner wrote from his home in Bavaria, "When I think of America, I do not think of barbed wire or guards. I think of a kitchen filled with laughter, of bread still warm from the oven, of people who saw not an enemy, but a man." That, perhaps, was the truest victory of all, not won on battlefields, but across dinner tables. In the simple act of sharing a meal, of choosing kindness when the world demanded cruelty, ordinary people had done something extraordinary. They had proven that peace begins not with treaties or armies, but with humanity itself. And so long after the last camps closed and the ships sailed home, the story of those Sunday dinners lived on in letters, in memories, and in the hearts of two nations that learned, through the simplest of acts, how to see one another again.